Hi, everyone. This is Jason Jordan. This is the second of three webinars that we're going to have on this topic, and we'll introduce our speaker. So Michelle Vazana is a partner here at Vantage and author of a great new book called Crushing Quota. And so this is, as I said, second of three webinars that we're doing, basically giving Michelle a chance to showcase the research and some of the really interesting insights that are in the book, which is just published last month. So with that, let me introduce the topic, building the groundwork for sales coaching greatness, and I will hand this over to Michelle Vazana.
Thanks, Jason. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Glad to have you here with us today for the second installment in our three-part series. I'd like to talk just briefly about who we are as a company, because not everyone on this broadcast was on the last one. So let me tell you just a little bit about our company. So Vantage Point, for the first 8 years of our history as a company, was focused squarely on the sales manager and sales leader population. All of our research, all of our intellectual property and thought leadership were around how to ensure that sales managers were truly as effective as possible and what sets them apart from their lower performing peers. So we've got a best-selling book, Cracking the Sales Management Code, and a recently released book, Crushing Quota, which is really the fodder for this webinar and the next one. And at Vantage Point, we are squarely focused on sales execution. In the last 2 years, we've expanded our footprint in the sales enablement space, and we now address all roles within the sales force. And we would go so far as to say that we speak frontline. And the reason we say that is because we are committed to ongoing research and thought leadership in the sales space. And our primary goal is to ensure that everything we do is evidence-based and directly connected to performance improvement and quota attainment. So what are we going to do today? Let's take a look at what you can expect in the next 45 minutes. Again, this is the second in a three-part series because there are three different sections in our book, Crushing Quota, and we're covering from a high level each one of those sections over the three webcasts. So in today's webcast, we're going to do a quick review and recap. If you were not in attendance for our last webinar, we'll give you some quick highlights for what we covered last time. And then we're going to go into the heart of this sort of middle portion of our book, Crushing Quota, by selecting what to coach for maximum impact, how to structure those coaching conversations to create the most value, and finally, how to operationalize coaching into your day-to-day job, which tends to be sort of the biggest sticking point between, aspiration and realization. So if you recall, on our last webinar, we said sales managers really are the key lever in any sales force. In fact, they have the most significant influence on the activity and performance of the salespeople they manage. And yet, in our most recent study, 75% of the sales managers had less than 49% of their sellers, fewer than 49% of their sellers at quota. And so the question is, what is that? What's going on? Why are the percentage of sellers in such a steady decline? And why has that decline been happening for the past 6 years? So in order to answer this really thorny question that's on the mind of sales leaders around the globe, we did a couple of really intensive studies into sales management practices, specifically sales coaching practices, over the last several years. The first one of those studies, just to remind those of you that were in attendance last webinar, and for those that are new, the first study was an in-depth examination of the three most prevalent types of coaching. Not only the most prevalent types of coaching that are trained, the most prevalent types of coaching that are studied and researched. And the goal for this study was to examine the degree to which managers provided each of these types of coaching, and then the impact of these types of coaching on quota attainment. And we looked at objective quota performance as well as sort of self-report performance. And there's some interesting findings there that I'll share in a bit. So that was the first study. The second study got a lot more into detail around the specific types of coaching practices, specifically managers that were coaching accounts, territories, opportunities, and sales calls And when we took a look at some of the different role characteristics and some of the manager demographics, and we took a look at how do these fit together to drive salesperson performance, and what are the differences between the practices of high performing, average performing, and low performing sales managers. So the information that we're going to share today is primarily from these two studies, and we will pepper in some additional research that we think is relevant and interesting. So when we think about how coaching impacts performance, the first thing that's really kind of interesting to think about is, what is it that really motivates salespeople, and how does coaching feed into that? So what we're going to do through the course of this webcast is we're going to examine the specific differences between high and low performers, as well as the difference in how that manifests itself in seller performance. So as we all know, sales managers are the key. That's no surprise. But just how big of a difference do sales managers make, and how do their practices impact the success of their reps? Well, in this one of these most recent studies, what we found is that the top 25% of managers, and there were over 1,000 managers to date in this study. The original study was a little over 500. But the top 25% of managers exceeded their revenue targets by about 15%. And the bottom performing managers fell short by 24%. And that's all good and fine and interesting, but what does it really mean from a revenue perspective and the impact to the organization? Well, when we put the math to these numbers, what we found is that top performing managers on average generated an extra $3.5 million per year per manager. So that's a significant difference in performance. And when you look into the differences between low and high performers, and then sort of that average middle, there's some really interesting but hidden things that we found by really digging into the data. So the first thing that we looked at was revenue performance for the top 25%, middle 50%, and bottom 25%. And when you look at the revenue performance only, the picture doesn't look so bad, because what we see here is 75% of the managers in our study were either near quota or above quota from a revenue perspective. However, when you take a look at a different metric, one that more and more organizations are paying attention to, the story gets a little more interesting and, quite frankly, a little bit more alarming. So when we took a look at the difference between the bottom 25%, the middle 50%, and the top 25%, what we found is there was almost no difference in the percentage of sellers at quota between the sort of core or middle and the bottom 25%. And what you can glean from that is that many of the middle performing managers are relying on 1 to 2 high performing sales reps, to get them close to their revenue targets. But the percentage of sellers across the team between the bottom and the middle is negligible. And then you look at the top 25%, and what you see is they get more than 30% of their reps, 30% more of their sellers to quota versus the bottom 75%. So that really begs the question, how do they do that? What are they doing differently that is causing them to have much higher participation rates across their team of sellers at quota? And this is where the first study becomes really, really interesting about the different types of coaching and what they mean as it relates to quota attainment. So again, we studied 3 different types of coaching that are the most prevalently deployed and the most prevalently researched. So we looked at capability coaching, which is really all about developing seller skills and knowledge. We took a look at outcome coaching, which is about assessing a seller against target results. And finally, we took a look at activity coaching, which is coaching that influences seller actions and behaviors. And if you recall, what we found is that activity coaching was the only type of coaching that was significantly related to quota attainment. Both capability coaching and outcome coaching although they impacted quota attainment, they didn't do it in a statistically significant way. So why does this matter and why do we care? Well, for the first reason, a lot of the competency models and associated coaching programs and general leadership models, they are really geared toward coaching seller capabilities. And we know through our research that that alone has negligible impact on quota attainment. That's why so many programs that are deployed sort of generically across an organization provide so little lift in sales performance. And then we take a look at outcome coaching, which is what we typically see when we talk about forecasting and certain elements of pipeline management. It's really only activity coaching that moves the needle. So what we're going to do next is we're going to explore the link between seller motivation and sales manager coaching. And we're going to do that by having you answer a question for us. We're actually going to deploy a poll to get your opinion on what you believe most significantly impacts seller motivation, and then we're going to tie it back to our research findings. So Jason, if you could go ahead and deploy the poll, that would be great.
So we have 26% of people said incentive compensation, 17% said achievement drive, and 57% said task clarity. So task clarity here is a clear winner.
Interesting. Okay, that's fascinating. And I'm hoping that's because some of you have read some of our blog posts and articles. It's really interesting because task clarity was indeed the most significant contributor to variation in salesperson motivation. In fact, task clarity accounted for more than 3 times as much variance in motivation as incentive, which was also more powerful than achievement drive. So task clarity is critically important, but the question then becomes, what is task clarity? What does that even mean? So task clarity is defined as the connection, the direct connection between the activities that you're asking salespeople to execute and the results that you're holding them accountable to achieve. And when we think about the framework that Vantage Point introduced through our research around making the connection between business results that can't be directly managed, but can certainly be inspected, sales objectives that are sort of interim guideposts that require consent and can't be directly managed, but can be influenced, and sales activities, which are really the lifeblood of sales execution. So making that connection in a very meaningful and direct way was the most significant contributor to salesperson motivation. In fact, it accounted for 34% of the variation in salesperson motivation. So very important to pay attention to task clarity, what it is, and how to create this clarity of task for the salespeople that you manage, because activities are really the only things that can be managed. Activity coaching is the only type of coaching that is directly and meaningfully related to quota attainment, and it is really the only thing that managers can manage anyway. So the next question you're probably thinking about is, okay, so managing activities is important and it's related to quota attainment, but which activities should we be managing and how do we know? Well, one of the first things to think about, and this is also covered in a lot of detail in Crushing Quota, is our original research about 7 years ago into sales metrics. We identified 4 categories of salesperson activities that can be managed. The first one being territory management, which is all about segmentation, prioritization, and adjusting allocation of effort based on account priority. Then we have account management, which is all about going deeper and wider and providing better attendance to individual important accounts. We have opportunity management activities, which are all about identifying, qualifying, pursuing, and winning individual deals. And then we have call management, which is really about planning, conducting, and documenting individual call outcomes. And the activities that any given manager decides to coach should really be related to which of these activities are most important and high impact for the objectives and outcomes they're wanting their salespeople to achieve. So an example is, worth 1,000 explanations. So I'm just going to give you one quick example from one of our clients. This is also in Crushing Quota. This particular example comes from a sales role that was called client manager. And these were salespeople that were responsible for anywhere between 10 and 20 major accounts. And they were selling risk management solutions. So in this particular example, there was a desire to have 5% year-over-year revenue growth for folks in this particular position. And the sales objectives that they were targeting were to expand business within existing accounts by 10%. And the goal was to do that through expansion of product mix. So expand the number of solutions that are being sold to each of these clients, being managed by these client managers. So then the high impact activities that were identified, there was really two of them that were most critical. One of them was to utilize account data and analyze that data to identify the most important growth opportunities, again, based on the analysis of that data, and then to schedule and conduct a formal meeting with key client contacts to review the analysis and qualify opportunities for account expansion. And then, of course, they had to have some standards that were put in place around, what kind of analysis needs to be conducted, what does a good formal meeting look like, and how many of these account analyses were being targeted for each of these client managers. So this is just one example of how one of our clients created clarity of task for this client manager population. And a couple of important things to note. One of the most common mistakes is going directly from business results to sales activities and not really considering sales objectives, which give more meaning and direction and guidance to salesperson activities. And they also give organizations a way to be able to measure interim progress through movement of leading indicators, like contents of your pipeline, sales cycle length, close rates, and those sorts of things. So this is really the most straightforward, practical, simple path that our research has identified as a way for sales managers to create that clarity of task. And by creating that clarity of task, they're really answering the question, what should I be coaching? How do I select what I should be coaching? So in this particular example, the most high impact coaching that the sales managers in this organization could be doing was coaching their people on conducting the appropriate type of analysis for each client, and then effective planning to conduct these high impact client meetings to review the analysis and identify new opportunities. So that really answers the first question of what should I be coaching? Which activities are going to be most high impact that I can then focus on for my sales coaching efforts to ensure effective salesperson execution. And once managers identify what to coach, creating that clarity of task, the next thing they have to set about answering is, how do they coach to those activities in the most effective way? In other words, how should they be coaching? So in our research, the most successful sales managers were much more likely than less successful managers to structure their coaching conversations. And when they structured their coaching conversations, there were three important elements for them to consider when they do that. One of them, of course, was the inputs that went into the meeting itself. So what kind of planning documents, any CRM notes or reports or updates, and they considered inputs both from their own perspective as managers, but also the sellers that they manage. The second thing was the most successful managers had agendas for their meetings. And what was interesting is that the most successful managers had fewer agenda items than the less successful managers. In fact, having agendas is not only important, but it's not a very typical practice. There's a colleague that Jason and I both know. Her name is Sarah McDonald, and she works for a company called Commercial Tribe. She's a very smart lady. And they've done thousands of observations of sales manager coaching interactions. And what they found is that fewer than about 15% of those interactions actually had agendas. And that's when managers knew they were going to be observed. So you can imagine compliance was probably higher when these managers knew they were being observed. But we did find a direct connection between having agendas for your interactions and performance. And finally, the most successful managers ensure that outputs are documented and committed, and that the sellers are the ones doing those. So a little interesting anecdote. One of the things that sales managers don't often consider is, are the salespeople in my coaching conversations taking notes? And how do I get them to ensure that they follow through on the commitments that they make? And one of the ways that we found that high-performing managers do that is they require their salespeople to send a summary email at the end of the coaching conversation to document agreed-upon actions and next steps. And that's a really great way to make sure that people take notes and are more accountable for actually executing the follow-up task that they've committed to. So one element of structuring coaching conversations and conducting good conversations is to make sure you've got the right content. Another important element is to make sure that you're actually conducting the conversation in a highly effective way. And what's interesting is that conducting effective coaching conversations is remarkably similar to conducting effective sales calls. So if you think about effective sales calls, there's a balance of the customer talking and the salesperson talking. There's some questioning, there's some providing of information, there's some give and take. And of course, there's an opening in the beginning to set the context. And then there's some closing, review of next steps, and some sort of commitment. So effective coaching conversations are remarkably similar. The manager opens the coaching conversation, creates some receptivity, sets the agenda, begins by getting the seller's perspective and point of view, sort of the basis for the dialogue, provides helpful information when needed, and has a very iterative, collaborative dialogue. And that's sort of the heart of effective coaching. And then, of course, closing with next steps and agreed upon action items. So we've covered how to identify what you should be coaching as a sales manager by identifying high impact activities that are directly related to the outcomes you want your salespeople to accomplish. That not only provides direction by creating clarity of task, but also contributes to salesperson motivation. We've covered how to conduct effective coaching conversations by structuring them appropriately based on the topic, as well as conducting them in the most collaborative way. And just by way of expectations, we're going to be diving into the specifics of different types of coaching conversations in our next webcast. So we're going to dive into the research findings around territory coaching, account coaching, opportunity coaching, and call coaching. And we'll share with you some specific findings, many of which were surprising, around those different types of coaching. But for this one, we're just going to kind of give you the highlights of how to sort of build the groundwork for effective coaching. And that includes creating clarity of task, structuring coaching conversations, and finally, the last piece of this is really operationalizing coaching into your day-to-day job. And this is where we find most coaching aspirations don't really lead to actual coaching practices. Because what managers tell us is that I just don't have time. I have more tasks to do than I've ever done. I'm more distracted than I've ever been. My boss is demanding updates to the pipeline. They're demanding the forecast. They're demanding input for reports. And I just don't have a lot of discretionary time. And so what happens is managers want to coach more. They have good intentions, but those intentions get lost in the reality of their day-to-day job. So when we think about operationalizing coaching, we think about this topic that we would call management rhythm. And management rhythm is defined as the pattern of formal and informal interactions that managers conduct to achieve sales goals. So very important point, very important distinction. And there were some surprising findings around management rhythms and the difference between those managers that are successful at operationalizing coaching versus those that are less successful. So before we get into the findings, I'm going to do another poll, and I want to get your input on an important question. And the question is, true or false, high-performing sales managers are more likely to formally schedule their coaching conversations. So Jason, go ahead if you would and launch this poll.
So 86% of the people said that is a true statement, and obviously 14% said that statement is false.
Okay. All right, so really interesting. So I'm going to give you a little insight around what the real answer is. So before I do that, let me introduce another concept to you. And we're going to call this the coaching formality continuum. And so it's not as if all coaching is either formal or informal. There are different levels of formality. So at the lowest level of formality, we have what we would call ad hoc coaching. And that's where it's just a spontaneous conversation. The salesperson knocks on your door, texts you, calls you. You might text or call them. It's a spontaneous conversation that wasn't planned. And then we have sort of the middle part of this, which is as needed, which means it might be scheduled, but it's not a regularly scheduled recurring conversation. And then we have these scheduled conversations that happen on a regular rhythm or cadence, and they tend to be highly formalized. So now let's go back to the question, true or false? Successful sales managers are more likely to schedule their coaching conversations versus their lower performing peers. The answer to that is false. We thought that was absolutely going to be true, but we did not find a statistically significant difference between the propensity to schedule conversations and quota or revenue attainment. So here's what we did find. Those managers that were top performers were more likely to keep scheduled coaching and not reschedule or cancel. So less or poorer performing managers were much more likely to have to cancel and reschedule pretty consistently. The higher performers were more likely to set a schedule they could keep and created some consistency with that. So again, that was one of those surprising findings. We thought for sure that the most successful managers would be significantly more likely to schedule their coaching, but that was not the case. So here's what we also know as it relates to the formality of coaching. When we dug into some of these coaching conversations, the formality of them, what was discussed in these coaching conversations, we found some other interesting things. We found that ad hoc coaching is far more prevalent than scheduled coaching. But we also found that ad hoc coaching is far less effective than scheduled coaching. And let's take a look at why that is the case. Think about the characteristics of an ad hoc conversation, right? Somebody wasn't expecting the conversation. Somebody was doing something else, probably the sales manager. They were probably busy generating some kind of report for their boss. And the salesperson says, hey, I need your help with this pricing question. So think about what's on the mind of that sales manager at that moment, right? What they really want to do is get off the phone and get back to the task they were already attending to when they got interrupted. And those conditions are not conducive for collaboration. They're not conducive for digging deep into a topic. In fact, in those cases, managers are much more likely to be directive versus collaborative. So conversations that are scheduled tend to create a little bit more space for effective dialogue. They tend to be a little more structured. We tend to have our phones turned off, or at least, on vibrate, and we're paying attention to each other. So the environment that exists for a scheduled coaching conversation is just overall more conducive to effective coaching and results in better outcomes. So what did we find as it relates to which types of coaching tended to be formally scheduled and which ones didn't? And this was an area where we found some more surprises. So when it comes to those coaching conversations that are formally scheduled, there were three types that tended to be formally scheduled. Territory coaching, specifically around segmentation and account prioritization, that tended to be formally scheduled. Account coaching, particularly account strategy, tended to be formally scheduled. And then opportunity strategy tended to be formally scheduled. The type of coaching that tended to be almost exclusively as needed was call coaching, meaning coaching sellers to either prepare for a sales call and or you attend a sales call and provide feedback. And when you think about it, that makes sense because we don't necessarily know 30 days in advance when a certain sales call is going to happen. So when the seller is successful at getting the meeting, then we have a time frame within which to plan the meeting. So once we dug into a little bit more, it made sense. Then when it comes to ad hoc, meaning somebody's wanting help on something, those tend to be either opportunity strategy discussions or preparation for upcoming calls. Those tend to be the most common ad hoc. And even opportunity coaching was more significantly prevalent than call coaching. So kind of interesting findings. And next time we get together on our next webcast, we will dig into the specifics of what kind of formalities involved in these different types of coaching, what are the different frequencies and that sort of thing. So there's another distinction I want to make as it relates to formality, because there's some failure points that managers can fall into without really thinking about it and realizing it. And one of them has to do with the fact that inspection, which is really sort of pipeline updates, preparation for the forecast, scrubbing the pipeline, those types of conversations tend to be formalized because the sales leader needs the forecast. The pipeline has to be scrubbed. It's not optional. So when you take a look at the types of interactions that most organizations put into a formal rhythm or cadence, it typically has to do with forecasting and pipeline management, specifically pipeline scrubbing. However, coaching tends to be much more at the manager's discretion, and it tends to be more informal. So how does that relate to the behavior of low, average, and high-performing managers regarding their tendency to use scheduled meetings to inspect the pipeline or prepare the forecast versus use that scheduled time for coaching? So what we found is the bottom 25% of managers were significantly more likely than high performers to use scheduled coaching time to conduct inspection-oriented interactions. In fact, the difference between the bottom 25% and the middle 50% was almost negligible, right? The average of those, we got 30%. But then there's this huge drop in the percentage of top performing managers who use scheduled time to do inspection. They realize that scheduled time is precious, and they maximize that scheduled time by diving deeply into opportunity planning versus pipeline scrubbing. So again, we'll get into this a little bit more detail in the next webinar. But before we really talk about calendarization a little bit more and what gets in the way of operationalizing coaching, I've got one last poll that I'd like to conduct and get your feedback on. So we have another true or false question. Successful managers coach each seller more frequently than their less successful peers. So Jason, why don't you go ahead and launch this one?
All right. And the survey says 33% said that is a true statement and 67% said that is a false statement.
Ah, okay. Hopefully they've been reading our blogs. Okay, so here's what's really interesting about that. When we conducted the management practices research around specific coaching practices, specifically the different types of coaching, territory, account, opportunity, and call, we did the research and did the analysis within companies and then across companies. And there was a lot of variation between company to company. For example, the frequency of coaching in one company could be very different than the frequency of coaching in another company, but the trends held true. And the trends indicated that less successful sellers or less successful managers coached each of their sellers more frequently than their more successful peers. And it was true in every case. So when you think about managers that are sort of running around and they're busy all the time, and they're the ones that say, oh, I talk to my people all the time, I'm constantly texting, I'm back and forth, they're calling me or I'm calling them, and they seem very busy and also very stressed, they're probably not top performers, and there's some reasons why. So here's what's interesting that we found. When we took a look at how frequently managers coached, and again, we'll get into the different types of coaching in the next webcast, but in general, the most successful managers coached each seller less frequently. So for example, if lower performers were coaching their sellers once a week around opportunity planning, high performers may have coached once a month. They also coach in more depth, meaning they cover fewer topics, but they cover those topics in more depth. They have fewer agenda items, and they tend to keep scheduled meetings a higher percentage of the time versus their less successful peers. Another thing to note, which was also interesting, is the time they spend in each of those coaching discussions tends to be longer versus their less successful peers. So they might spend an hour versus 30 minutes, or 30 minutes versus 15 minutes. And these trends, while they manifested a bit differently company by company, held true across companies time after time after time. So when we think about why it's so difficult for managers to operationalize coaching into their day-to-day job, one of the most typical failure points we see is planning for optimal conditions. So I'm going to set a schedule that will work under optimal conditions, but if a bunch of stuff hits my radar screen, I'm going to have to cancel some of these coaching discussions. So the most successful managers have fewer meetings, but more impactful meetings, and they conduct them a higher percentage of the time. So what happens when managers identify the most high impact activities to coach, structure those coaching conversations in ways that drive more effective dialogue, and then operationalize those in a realistic way, is they end up with a higher percentage of their sellers at quota, right? And we did the research, we did the heavy lifting, we asked the hard questions, and we found the answers, some of which were very highly surprising.